Good morning, everyone. I am Eric Lufer, the President of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on Governor Snyder's fiscal year 2018 education budget. The school aid fund budget receives more funding than the state's general fund general purpose budget and used to carry out one of the few functions required of our Michigan governments by the state constitution. The school aid fund budget has been an area of interest for many years, but has grown in interest during Governor Snyder's time in office because of its use of funding for universities and community colleges and because of the pressure created by increasing legacy costs. This presentation will walk through the governor's proposals for fiscal year 2018, putting those recommendations in context with recent years. In recent years, this webinar is focused on the overall budget, paying close attention to the school section of the budget. This year, because of staffing issues at the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, the presentation will focus primarily on the school aid fund budget. We continue to seek an analyst that can monitor state finances, tax policy, and State Department operations. If you know someone that would be interested in engaging in the Research Council's brand of nonpartisan, non-biased public policy research, please let them know of the possibilities. We expect to discuss the entire budget when we reconvene for this webinar next year. The Citizens Research Council is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is the Citizens Research Council's 100th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. You can learn more about the Research Council at crcmich.org. At the right of your website, you will find an opportunity to sign up for our email distribution list to be notified about newly released papers. Next slide. Our presenter today is Craig Thiel, a Senior Research Associate for the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. Craig has been with the Research Council for about a dozen years in total as a fellow, Director of State Affairs, and as our lead researcher on education issues. He has become one of the foremost experts in the state on the state school aid fund. Please note that we are recording this webinar and we will post it to our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Second, we have put everyone on but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you speak. To ask a question, please type that into the questions pane that should be appearing on your screen. You can type these questions in at any time. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 517-485-9444. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any feedback you have. With that, I will turn it over to Craig.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to echo Eric's welcome and just hopefully you're enjoying the beautiful spring weather we're having. It's registering 50 degrees here in Lansing this morning, so we should be holding this webinar outside by February weather standards. So I want to go through a series of slides over the next 30 minutes or so and then leave ample time for questions. Just reinforce what Eric said. Please write your questions in the questions page and we'll address those at the end of the webinar. Before I kind of get into the meat of the presentation, I kind of want to give a high-level view of what's going on with state revenues, both in terms of the general fund and the school aid fund. This first slide presents the revenue estimates for the state's general fund going back to 2015 as the base year and extends out to 2020. What I've done here is compared the revenue estimates from last May's revenue estimating conference with the January conference that was just held. The May conference was used as the basis for the current year budget and the decisions for spending in the general fund, and as well as for the education budget. And then the January estimate becomes the basis for the governor's budget recommendation for next year, the fiscal 2018 budget. I guess the main takeaway here, as you can see, is the improvement in both the revenue estimates in 16, the year we just closed, and 17, the year we're operating in, for the general fund. You can see the combined total improvement for 16 and 17 is about $430 million. And then looking forward in the 2018 year, a reduction of about $84 million. So the significance here is that the ongoing revenue available to the state has improved, but in large measure, the improvement in revenue we see in 16 and 17 is largely tied to one-time issues, notably timing issues with some credits that are going out the door for the business tax and moving those out of the 16-17 year. The bottom line here is that the change in the revenue forecast provides the governor in 18 with a little more cushion to develop his recommendations. I should note also that the revenue estimates don't include any income tax cut that's currently being contemplated in the Michigan House. However, the revenue estimates do include the effects of already passed policy changes dealing with taxes as well as budget issues. Even though we have what might be claimed as income tax cut fever in the Michigan legislature right now, this kind of glosses over the significant reductions in future revenues that have already been baked into the revenue estimates. This chart shows 4 major components. First, we've got the estimated general fund general purpose line, and that goes back to 2015 and is at about $10 billion. And that blue body of the chart grows significantly in 15, 16, 17, 18, and then starts flattening out in 19. The annual growth rates in 18 for that blue portion is 2.3%, and then flattens out to just over a half a percentage point, and then 1.3% in 20 and 1.1% in 2021. The pieces that are constraining the growth there have to do with the personal property tax repeal that was voted on by state voters in 2014, and as those start to come online, they eat into the state's general fund resources. If you recall, the proposal called for reimbursement to local units of government for lost personal property tax, and the way that the state honored that reimbursement pledge was to peel off some of the use tax, which would have gone to the general fund, and use that instead to make whole local governments. So that portion of the foregone revenues represented by the red line, red bar in this graph. And then part and parcel to that proposal was an expansion of the homestead property tax credit, which is a refundable credit against the state income tax, and that is borne entirely by the general fund, and that portion is represented in this graph by the top yellow bar. And then finally, the piece that is growing beginning in 2019, expanding in 2020, and then again in 2021 has to do with the road plan. If you recall, the plan was to raise approximately $1.2 billion in new resources for infrastructure investment in the state. The compromise that came out of that plan was roughly a 50-50 split in meeting that $1.2 billion mark, half of the resources coming from existing state funds, and in this case the general fund, and then the other half through a series of income tax, revenue diversions from the income tax that would have otherwise gone to the general fund. So that is a component of this graph represented by the gray piece. Overall, in 2021, revenue estimates are that the amount of foregone revenue to the state will approximate $1.2 billion. Again, the combination of these pieces ratchets up from about $350 million of foregone revenue in 2017 to $375 million in 2018, bumps up to $750 million in 19, and then approaches $1 billion in 2020 before hitting that $1.2 billion figure in 2021. So again, income tax cut fever that is in the legislature currently is not represented in these revenues and would further pull down the general fund resources available to the state. So looking back, I think it's important to look back over time and see what has occurred with the general fund. This chart goes back to 2000 and represents two components. First is the actual general fund resources, and that's shown in the red bar at the top. And then the blue line at the bottom is those general fund resources adjusted for inflation. And what we can see is that in 2029, the general fund resources and actual dollar amounts are just about where they were in 2000. We have been on a stable increase here going back to really the depths of the recession in 2009. And since that time, general fund resources have been on the upswing. But when we factor in inflation, we can see that the real purchasing power of the general fund has declined significantly, bottoming out at in the depths of the recession, and then just kind of hovering above the inflation rate for the last 5 years, and projected to just hit the inflation rate roughly for the next 4 years. So the key takeaways here is that we're steady growth since 2009, following the depths of the recession, but still below 2000 levels in terms of the real dollars. The purchasing power of the general fund is down about 30%. Just real quickly, looking at the revenue estimates going back to May and January for the school aid fund, they've been on target more or less. We don't see the differences that we saw in the general fund, largely because of the lack of uncertain factors in the school aid fund. The main culprit with the general fund are these credits associated with the business tax, which hit against the general fund and don't hit against the school aid fund. If we look over this, going back to 2015 and out to 2020, school aid funds average about 3% growth rate pretty consistently. Looking a little further back, This chart presents the actual dollars available to the school aid fund and then adjusting those resources to inflation, going back to 2000 when school aid fund came in at just about 9.9 billion. By 2019, the resources available will have risen to about 13.1 billion. Again, very steady increase going back to 2009 when the total school aid fund settled in just below 11 billion. Looking at the effects of inflation here, we can see that after declining throughout most of the 2000s, real resources available to the school aid fund have increased and have settled in just about where they were in 2000. So again, comparing with the general fund, which is down about 30% in inflation-adjusted resources, school aid fund has returned to 2000 levels in terms of the real value of that fund, but up considerably in actual dollars. So having looked at those revenue estimates, I think it's important to see what has changed with the current state budget and how that sets up for the governor's budget recommendation for 2018. So this slide provides a high-level summary of what we just went through. So the 2016 year-end general fund general purpose balance was raised to $604 million. That's an improvement of almost $500 million from what was projected back in May. Again, a large portion of this was tied to the revenue adjustments between May and June. About $290 million was tied to those revenue adjustments, but again, a large chunk of that revenue adjustment is really one-time in nature related to the business tax credits that didn't come due as expected and will be pushed into future years. Some of the improvement in the general fund balance has to do with lower than expected spending for the last fiscal year. Appropriations that have lapsed and have returned to the general fund, and those resources are available in 2017 for the budget there. The bottom line is that the budget has a little more cushion entering 2018, providing the governor with some decisions on what to do with those additional resources. Either invest those resources, save them for a rainy day, or possibly returning them to state taxpayers in some form. So with that, I want to transition over and hit on the education budget in particular. As Eric mentioned, we're down in some staffing capacity here. So we're going to pour through the school aid budget, and our hope is to revisit the entire budget picture here in the spring when our staffing is back to normal. So at a high-level view, the budget for K-12 education is about $12.6 billion in state resources. This is up 2% from the current year. Looking back to 2011, state funding for K-12 is up about $1.6 billion. Which sounds pretty healthy, but as we'll show, a lot of that increase has been directed to paying off some legacy debts associated with the school employees retirement system. The other piece of the picture in terms of K-12 funding has to do with student enrollment. Student enrollment, as you recall, has been on a statewide, has been on a long-term decline going back to 2003. The trend continues in the upcoming year, but it's much smaller. We were measuring statewide student enrollment declines in the tens of thousands just a few years ago, and now we're measuring it in single thousands, which is important because the resources that are available, total resources available, distributed on a per pupil basis, might improve the per pupil allocation, and that's significant for school districts. But for those school districts that are dealing with declining student enrollment, even with additional per pupil resources, fewer students equates to fewer overall dollars. So that's created some financial challenges for those districts that have lost a lot of students. The other important takeaway, high level, is that the school aid fund is continuing to support higher ed appropriations, and in this year's budget recommendation, the governor is supporting a proposal to fund the entire community college operations appropriation out of the school aid fund, which draws resources away from other uses. So this following presentation is going to hit on these highlight areas. I'm going to talk about the foundation allowance, what's happened over time with this, and what the governor's recommending. Look at some proposals to differentiate funding based on type of students as well as the type of schools that are educating those students. Dig in into the governor's proposal to fund at-risk students. An increase is recommended there. The governor is recommending to reduce the funding that's made available for non-public school students that are educated in public schools through the shared time program. I'll talk about that. Talk about state allocations for the school employee retirement system, and then finally look at what's going on with Detroit Public Schools and how that is addressed in the budget. So the per pupil foundation allowance is the primary funder for K-12 districts, both traditional and charter. The governor's recommending an increase of $50 to $100. Those districts that are receiving the minimum foundation grant would receive a $100 increase per pupil, and those that are at the top of the band, those receiving the basic grant, would get a $50 increase. Districts in between the two amounts would get an amount somewhere between $50 and $100. This is the 2X formula that the governor has proposed and the legislature has been using to fund the foundation allowance over the last few years. Significantly, this further narrows the gap between those two grant amounts to just under $700. Significantly, this is a huge improvement from where it stood, as you can see in this chart, going back to 2000 when it was about $1,500. Our estimates that if this proposal goes through, 85% of the districts in the state, that's both traditional and charter districts, would be receiving the minimum grant, an improvement from 46% in 2000 when only 46% of the districts were receiving the minimum grant. The governor's recommending a total of $128 million to fund the increase in the foundation grant. The budget proposal, I think, is significant in its adoption of this differentiated funding model. What I mean here is it's an attempt by the governor to recognize that costs at the K-12 level vary based on both the type of student that's being educated, but also the type of school environment that students are being educated in. Significantly, the governor is recommending for a group of charter schools in the state, specifically cyber charters, those identified in the revised school code as cyber charters. Their foundation allowance would be reduced by 20%. This would be for those districts that are up and running, those charters that are up and running. Those that are in their first year of operation would receive the full foundation grant, and then in the second year of operation and each year after, 20% reduction in foundation grant, or 80% of their foundation. The assumption is that it costs less to operate these schools, and the governor is recommending that the foundation, which is the primary operating resources for schools in general, reflect that cost differential. And that's represented in the budget by a savings of about $16 million across all of these schools. The governor is recognizing that it costs more to educate kids enrolled in grades 9 through 12. Again, this would be across all high school students, regardless of where they're being educated, traditional as well as charter schools. And he is recommending a new categorical grant funded at $22 million to provide a $50 per pupil enhancement for students enrolled in grades 9 through 10. Again, recognizing that the courses, facilities associated with high schools are more expensive to operate than maybe the K through 5, K through 8 environment. And then another area where the governor's recommending some differentiated funding has to do with at-risk students. This isn't a new program, as many of you know, but it is a program that's designed to address some of the resource needs associated with students who come to school in an economically disadvantaged environment. The state has a program that has provided a supplement to the foundation grant to address those needs. This grant has been in existence going back to Proposal A, and the governor is recommending an increase here. A total of $150 million additional over current year for a total statewide of about $529 million. In addition to the added investment here, the governor's calling on a change in eligibility both at the district level as well as the type of students that would be eligible for these resources. In terms of the districts, all districts in the state would be eligible. Current law has been that those above the basic foundation grant are not eligible to receive these resources. So that rules out about 40 or so school districts in the state and the students that are in those districts from receiving these resources. So it would open up those districts to participate in this program. Also, the governor's recommending changing the definition of the students that would be eligible. Currently, the definition of at-risk focuses on those that are eligible for free meals under the federal student meal program. The governor's expanding this definition to include all economically disadvantaged students. That would include those students that are eligible for reduced meals, the federal SNAP program, federal TANF program, homeless students, migrant students, as well as children in foster care. It's estimated that the $529 million would be shared among an additional 130 students when you open up these districts and students to the funding. Still requires the districts to use the multi-tier system of support. for delivering services to these students, but with the additional dollars comes some expanded accountability and measures of success. The governor's asking for focus on reducing absenteeism among disadvantaged students and improving 8th grade math amongst these students, as well as participation in career technical education, dual enrollment, international baccalaureate, and AP programs. So again, with the additional resources, some additional accountability. In terms of the funding formula to distribute, historically the resources have been distributed based on each individual district's foundation grant, up to a cap of 11.5% of that grant. With the additional districts eligible, the governor's recommended the resources be distributed based on the average statewide foundation. It's estimated that each student would receive the equivalent of about $778 under this this program. This is notably the second large increase in the last 3 years for the program. There was $70 million added to the budget in 2016. So this would be a continuation of what the governor recommended and the legislature approved in 2016. Another area where the governor is recommending a change has to do with a program that allows non-public school students to enroll in public schools and receive instruction in basically elective courses. This is the shared time program. Both traditional and charter schools receive a portion of the per-pupil grant based on the number of non-public students that they enroll, the FTE, so a fraction of a full student. The growth in this program has been substantial, both in terms of the number of non-public schools students participating as well as the funding that's allocated. It's estimated that in 2018, without any changes to the program, the state will reimburse districts about $115 million. So that's the equivalent of about $80 per pupil from the school aid fund to support this program. If you recall, last year in the budget recommendation, the governor had attempted to reduce the state's spending for this program by capping the amount of the FTE that a district could claim for these students to about 1/3 of a FTE. That didn't make it through the legislative process. So this year the governor is recommending, rather than reducing the FTE reimbursement, just capping the total program at $60 million. It pulls the resources out of the, in terms of the budget, it pulls the resources out of the foundation allowance line item and creates a new categorical grant that districts would apply for purposes of claiming the foundation dollars associated with non-public school students. I think most significantly, it doesn't address really the crux of the issue, which is what should account for or be defined as a non-essential course. This is the issue that's been driving the participation in this program and the funding in this program. This slide here provides a picture of the growth in shared time going back to 2006. As you can see, the total number of FTE, so this isn't head count, there's many more actual students participating in the program than the FTE. This would be a full-time equivalent student, is up about 280% since 2006. in the big picture of statewide enrollment, it's still very small. It's only about 1% of the total enrollment statewide. But for a few districts, this is a significant portion of their FTE enrollment and therefore their foundation allowance resources that they receive. 8 districts, in 8 districts, the shared time account for 10% or more of their total enrollment. So 10% or roughly 10% of their foundation grant is coming from non-public school students that are enrolled in their district. And then a number of districts, I should say a few districts, account for a very large share of the overall shared time enrollment. We looked at the numbers, and about 10 districts account for over 50% of the total shared time. So again, this is a program that's available statewide, but it's being used in very heavily in a few districts. So switching over to the governor's recommendation for the school employee retirement system, he continues to make considerable investment in the school retirement system. This is over and above what districts are paying to the retirement system from their foundation grant. So this investment in the retirement system is to pay down the legacy costs associated with this system. Again, the governor is maintaining the funding commitment for the liability costs for the system over and above the cap. The cap was established in 2012, basically limiting the exposure school districts have to finance these legacy costs. The cap is set at 20.96% of their payroll. So anything over and above that cap, the state has been funding out of resources from the school aid fund. The good news is because of recent investment return as well as experience providing health care to the retirees through the system, the baseline costs for the state have declined. Last year, over $1 billion was recommended, or close to $1 billion of the state share of above the cost. This year, that number's down to $869 million. The resources that have been freed up from this, roughly $113 million, however, are going to be reallocated for some other retirement system costs that are involved, I should say, part of the governor's budget recommendation. And that has to do with the reducing the assumed rate of return for the defined benefit investments, not just for the school employee system, but for all the state systems, the state employee system, as well as other retirement systems that the state manages. In the case of the schools employee system, the proposal is to phase in 1/2 percentage point reduction in the assumed rate of return. Right now, the legacy systems that are operating assume an annual rate of return of 8%. This would ratchet down to 7.5% over a 2-year period. And there's some financial effects associated with these change in assumptions. In the short term, this will increase the unfunded liabilities that are held by the system. Basically, because the assumption is that those resources that they have to pay off those liabilities won't grow as robustly. The amount that they will need to fund in the future increases. And then secondly, the normal costs. These are the costs that would apply to paying for the retirement benefit in the current year for the employees that are working currently would increase, because again, the resources that are being put away to pay off the benefits in the future won't grow at the 8% clip. Instead, they'd be growing at 7.5%, and so you would need to put additional resources away today to make sure you have enough money on hand in the future with this lower expected rate of return. On a positive side, over long term, reducing the investment assumptions kind of guards against exposure to additional unfunded liabilities. If the state were to miss its investment return mark, the baseline number that they're trying to hit would be lower. So it does reduce the potential for growing the unfunded liabilities. And this is being driven largely from recent experience. The state retirement system hasn't been hitting the 8% mark on a long-term perspective, so 7.5% return rate is more in line with what the experience has been. So again, the resources that are freed up from the state the state's responsibility for funding unfunded liabilities that are above that cap, those resources are going to help pay for this this change in the investment rate of return. Additional $91 million are going to be allocated to pay for the state share of those of this change, and then the employer share, which is the increase in the normal costs. The state in the budget, it would pick up that cost, which is about $50 million, or about $33 per pupil. So that $113 million baseline cost reduction I talked about earlier is going to be more than offset by an increase in retirement costs associated with this change. And then for those districts that participate in MIPSers, the governor is continuing to recommend a $100 million MIPSer cost offset payment. This equates to about $67 per pupil. As you recall, this has been in place for a number of years now, and the governor's maintaining that appropriation. Total state contribution to MIPSers on behalf of school districts is up to $1.1 billion this year. Again, this is the state contribution. When you add in what the locals are contributing, it's over $3 billion, and that's what this chart shows. The legacy cost contributions are broken out here in terms of the pension portion paid for by the employer, the school districts, the legacy costs associated with the health care that retirees are eligible for, and then the early retirement incentive, and then finally the state share. The rise in these legacy cost contributions are directly tied to the growth in the unfunded liabilities that the system has. If we go back to 2005, the unfunded liabilities for the system, for the pension alone, were just $9 billion. In 2016, those liabilities are estimated at $26 billion. On the health side, back in 2005, before there was pre-funding of those benefits, there was no unfunded liabilities recognized in terms of the contribution rate. Today, the unfunded liabilities for the health are estimated at $9 billion. So again, the growth in these unfunded liabilities are what's driving the increase in allocations, both in terms of state and local resources. And as you can see, with the cap in place, the growth has been really a responsibility of the state to pick up through the school aid fund. In terms of the effects of these legacy costs on per pupil funding, this chart shows the foundation grant and breaks the foundation grant into two pieces: the share that's required to go to fund the legacy costs for the retirement system, and then what's left over. And then I've added on top here the component that the state's picking up because of that cap on employer contributions. The good news here is that the discretionary piece, when we look back to 2012, is up about $500. Also related to that is that in recent years, the portion of the foundation grant that's going to the legacy costs has been held pretty constant at about $1,300. This is an average figure statewide. The state piece has been growing from 2012, when the state was allocating just a few $100s for this, now contributing over $1 billion on a statewide basis. That's the equivalent of about $646 per pupil. So that's kind of the good news from the district's perspective. If we look back to 2011, however, the amount of discretionary resources available is down about $100. So clearly the requirement to fund these legacy costs have been crowding out the discretionary resources that would have otherwise been available to school districts. Real quickly, I just want to hit on the Detroit Public Schools. If you recall, last year the governor's budget had proposed dealing with the financial crisis in the Detroit Public Schools. That worked its way through the legislature and was finally incorporated into some legislation passed last summer that effectively split Detroit Public Schools into a old district, dealt with financing the legacy debts of the district, and a new district that came online in July to educate students. The package involved $617 million to meet those legacy debts. Those are, again, being financed by the old district, and then some of those resources were earmarked to help the startup costs of the new district. The solution for repaying the $617 million financing package was to reallocate a portion of all of the local school operating tax that's collected in Detroit, and use that over time to pay off the $617 million figure. That created a hole in the new district's foundation grant, because those resources wouldn't be available. To fill that hole, the legislation reallocates $72 million per year from the state's tobacco settlement resources, and those dollars are appropriated in this budget to reflect that agreement. The new district began operating in July with a clean balance sheet, and it's just worth noting that part of the legislation passed in the summer will bring to an end the Education Achievement Authority, and those schools will be folded back into the new DPS district beginning in July of 2017. So let me run through some of the highlights from the higher education budget. Governor's representing or proposing a 2.5% increase for the operations of Michigan's 15 operation appropriations for Michigan's 15 public universities. Half of this is allocated through the performance funding formula, the other half on a proportional basis. The individual school increases range from about 1.9% to 3.4%. He's recommending additional state general fund investment in 3 of the financial aid programs, also calling for the continuation of tuition restraint by the universities. If you recall, the performance funding dollars are tied to adherence to this tuition restraint language, and that is set at 4.2% over the current year tuition levels, or $475 per student, and then continuing to use the school aid fund to help support the state appropriations for operations. With this increase, the governors will bring operations funding to $1.44 billion, which exceeds the level that was in place in 2011 before Governor Snyder had recommended a 15% reduction to operations funding in 2012. So this increase does return the total operations support for public universities to that 2011 level. But if we look going back to 2002 and adjusting for inflation, we can see that the resource base for operations is still considerably below where it was when we factor in inflation. Resources are only at about $1 billion of a original baseline figure of $1.6 billion in 2002. I'll make a note here that the appropriations to the 28 community colleges in the state, the operations support for those institutions is held constant in the governor's budget. He has made a recommendation not just for community colleges but for a number of local governments that in lieu of appropriations increases, the local governments are going to receive additional resources through the personal property tax reimbursement mechanism that was set up in 2014 to allow for the exemption of personal property tax. If you recall, I talked about earlier the state vote to approve the exemption of personal property tax. This created a hole for a number of local units of government that rely on those taxes, and the state's commitment was to reimburse dollar for dollar those lost resources. The reimbursement mechanism for tax year 2016 has taken place. And what has happened basically is that the resources that the state put aside for this reimbursement are greater than what was needed to reimburse local units of government, and rather than pull back those resources to state coffers, they're remaining in the pot to reimburse local units of government. And the over-reimbursement across all units of government is about $135 million estimated, and this splits out among the local units according to their personal property tax losses. So the cities will be receiving about $64 million above what is estimated to be their personal property tax loss. Counties $37 million, and community colleges about $15.7 million. The state law is written such that these excess funds are to be proportionally distributed. So the resources aren't being distributed to the units based on any measure of their current need, but really just based on the share of their personal property tax loss is of the total. The governor had called for the legislature to look at an alternative distribution method, and that's something that we'll look to see if the legislature examines as they consider how to deal with the additional personal property tax reimbursement payments. One final area I want to hit on here has to do with this use of the general fund and school aid fund kind of interchangeably, and what's this look like over time. This chart shows two things. It shows programs that were previously funded from the general fund and have been shifted over to the school aid fund. This is represented by the blue bar in this chart. And then the general fund, direct general fund appropriations to support K through 12. And what we can see is that although the general fund support for K-12 has bounced around a little bit, we see a growing use of the school aid fund to fund programs that were previously financed from the general fund. Most significantly here is the higher ed appropriations that account for over 75% of the blue bar. And in 2017, the total amount of school aid fund going to other non-K-12 programs was about $700 million, and that will increase in 2018 under the governor's budget to $840. The most significant component of that increase has to do with the proposal to fund the community college appropriations entirely out of the school aid fund. So just wrapping up here, the education budget from 50,000 feet, kind of a continuation of the governor's thinking to differentiate funding across both the type of students, but also the type of schools that are educating those students. In terms of the foundation grant, he's using the 2X formula as a way to address the horizontal equity that's, treating equal students kind of equally, bringing up the bottom low spending districts closer to the top. But at the same time, he's promoting some spending plans that address students and schools that have different needs. This is notable in the at-risk program, the additional funding for high school students, and then the reduction in spending, proposed spending for cyber charters to reflect the cost differentials among those groups. Continued large investment in the retirement system, but the governor's budget holds school districts harmless from the effects here. Again, just using the resources that are freed up associated with the state's retirement costs and using them to bring some reforms to the system that match recent experience. And finally, continue to use the school aid fund to finance higher education appropriations. This is largely seen as a way for the school aid fund to kind of ease some of the pressures that are on the general fund, both in terms of the tax policy decisions that have already been made, such as the personal property tax reimbursement plan, the income tax revenue that's going to roads, homestead property tax. This is a way to kind of spread some of the general fund pressures onto the school aid fund by increasing the resources that are available, school aid fund resources that are made available to higher ed appropriations. What's unknown at this time is how potential income tax relief that's being discussed in the legislature will affect school funding. whether directly or indirectly. And I guess as we continue to monitor the budget, we'll know as that proposal develops how it will affect schools, and would likely to report that out to you. So with that, I think we have some time to take some questions.
Thank you, Craig. So we do have a few questions. Before we dig into those, I want to let everybody know that the presentation has been recorded. It will be put on the website shortly after we finish here. It takes a few minutes for it to process and convert into an electronic file, but we will get that done as soon as possible. Additionally, the slides themselves will be available online. We tried to get this done prior to the presentation. Technical difficulties got in the way, but they will be available. On the top of our website, there's a link for resources, and a drop-down menu says presentations. This will be at the top of that list when that's finished. So the first question came in about the shared time that you discussed a little bit. Are you able to identify the 10 districts that account for more than 50% of the shared time cost? And do you have a theory for why this is happening in those districts and not all districts statewide?
Right. So the shared time program that I talked about, again, has a number of districts, or I should say a few districts that are participating pretty heavily in this. A report that we issued in December of 16 highlights those districts. Off the top of my head, Brighton, Grand Rapids come to mind. Brighton stood out because they're a district that about 20% of their total FTE student population is from the non-public sector. So I'd reference that report from late last year for those districts, so listing those districts. The why are they showing up? I think the answer there is a number of districts have used this as a way, as a kind of a way to supplement their foundation funding that they get from the students that they enroll. They've been pretty entrepreneurial in marketing this program, and they've been able to offer these services to the public, non-public school students, and it's been largely viewed as a win-win for the traditional district in terms of increasing their enrollment, and then a win for the non-public school because it helps defray some of the costs that they might otherwise have to bear in offering programs. So the area where it's costly, or it's deemed as a negative, is the resources are largely coming out of the total school aid fund pot of money, and that means there's fewer resources to share amongst all the other districts in the state.
So sticking with the shared time question, we have a follow-up. Can you provide some sort of background on what kind of instructional services are shared time students accessing? And then if you could talk about sort of the logistics, are the students being transported to a public school, or is that being provided in a different environment?
Well, the law restricts the courses that can be made available to non-public schools to non-elective courses. So basically courses that don't tie to kind of the Michigan merit curriculum. So things that would be excluded would be math, science, English, civics, government. It varies in terms of the offerings. You'd have to look at each program and see what's being offered. In terms of where the students are receiving the services, it's a combination of within the traditional public school district environment, but a lot of the instruction is being delivered at the non-public school site. And that has been the practice for some time. That's not a new development, but it's a combination of having kids attend the public school building to get that instruction, as well as the public school teacher basically working in the non-public school setting.
A question about the retirement system. You talked about some of the adjustments being made with the assumed rate of return and so on. Do these mean that the districts will need to contribute this year to the retirement fund?
Well, they're going to continue to contribute. Their contribution, at least for the legacy costs, is capped at that 20.96% of payroll figure. The changes that the governor's proposing, which would increase some of the employers' costs, districts' costs associated with the normal costs. His proposal requires the state to pick up those costs, so those would be met through an allocation, separate allocation from the school aid fund, as opposed to through the district's foundation grant. So the contribution rate does increase for school districts for the normal costs, but that increase is going to be offset by the governor providing these additional resources so districts don't have to eat into their foundation grant.
Questions about the pension and health care for retirees. I'm going to put this one out there, and if you can't answer it now, perhaps we can double back to the question or make sure the question is answered satisfactorily. What is the percentage of funding for retiree pension and health care for both state and education employees? Are there any groups left that have defined benefit pensions and health care, or are all on defined contribution packages now? We have another question that came in that's similar to that. What is the likelihood the state will move from a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan, and when might that occur?
Well, the other state systems have been closed to new entrants. So the state employee system, the judges' retirement system, the legislative system have all been closed to new entrants, and those are all set up as 401k style plans. The school employee system is still considered an open system. The reforms that were enacted in 2012 created the I'm sorry, the old legacy systems were closed for school employees, and what was put in place was a kind of a hybrid system that consists of a little bit of a pension plan and a little bit of a 401k system, but it's still considered an open defined benefit plan for school employees. In terms of the percentages, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but if you want to reach out to me, I could dig those up. But yes, so we still have an open defined benefit plan for school employees, and the other part of the question was, what's the likelihood or what's the prospects for closing the system? At the end of last year, there was an effort to close that hybrid system and close the school employee retirement system and transition over to a 401k. That didn't make it out of the legislature, but there were signals that they're going to look at that again this year, this legislative session. So I guess stay tuned to see.
So we have one just came in. Do the cyber charters really cost less to operate? What are assumptions behind their presumed lower instruction cost?
I'd say at this juncture, that's supposition, whether or not they cost less. The governor in the presentation highlighted the fact that these schools don't have certain facility costs that regular charter schools might have, building costs, paying for lights, gas, what have you. But I'm not aware of any Michigan-specific research that shows the cost differentials specific to traditional cybers in a regular traditional chartered school and a cyber charter school. It is worth noting here that the proposal to reduce the foundation grant for cyber charters is specific to those schools that offer 100% of their services in an online environment, and those schools that are identified in the revised school code. There are a number of students that are enrolled in traditional public school districts as well as other charter schools that may receive 100% of their education in an online environment. Those students in the foundation grants tied to those students wouldn't be impacted by this proposal. It would just be those cyber charters identified as 6E in the Section 6E in the revised school code.
So one last question at the prerogative of the host here. You had a chart that shows the increase in legacy cost and going from 800 million, I guess it was, to now it's almost 4 times that amount. Can you talk about what's driving that cost? Is it the Great Recession, that period we refer to from 2007 to 2009 when the stock market crashed in such a way? We know that there's sort of some smoothing that spreads that cost out, but we saw the cost increasing before that, and it doesn't seem to be subsiding as we move away from that period. So any information about what's driving that increased cost and whether there's any future hope that that's going to flatten out and will control that cost?
Well, a number of factors, but I think the largest was the effects of the investment experience in 2008, 2009, and because those losses are spread out, we see those show up for a number of years, basically over the next 5 years as portions of those losses are spread out. So those significant losses in 08, 09 are spread out over the next 5 years as and driving those unfunded liabilities up. And as I've noted, the reforms that were made to the system are designed to kind of cap the district's exposure to those increases by providing this cap on their contributions. But indirectly, they are still exposed to it because the school aid fund picks up the amount above that cap, and those are resources that would have otherwise gone to districts, either in the form of the foundation grant or some other funding. So they're still exposed to this. I think what we see with the kind of those investment losses running kind of running through the smoothing period, and we're seeing better than expected investment returns, at least in 16. We see the governor proposing a way to safeguard against future growth in unfunded liabilities by making changes to some of the assumptions that underlie the retirement system, specifically here reducing the investment return assumption. It still means resources are allocated to the retirement system, but in this case, rather than paying for those legacy costs from past years, we're kind of safeguarding against an increase in those legacy costs.
Okay, we have exhausted our questions from the audience and exhausted our time. So let me conclude by saying once again that the slides themselves will be available very soon as we finish this exercise. Again, on our website, there's a link for resources in the top menu. Drop down for that is presentations, and this will be the top one there. We have also recorded this session, and as it is uploaded to processed and uploaded to YouTube, it should be available within half an hour to an hour. Thank you all for coming, and if you have any follow-up questions, you can reach us by email or by phone, and all that information is available on our website at crcmich.org. Enjoy this beautiful day, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.